Hi, I'm Leon,
And I'm Bridget.
and this is the book of Genesis, the first 11 chapters. We're going to start out by just going over some very basic points, but we want you to kind of get a grasp of what's happening in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Genesis, of course, is the beginning. It talks about the things that we need to know that would set up everything else for the rest of the Bible. The first 11 chapters are important because it takes up, actually in way of time, over half of the entire Bible. So what you have is the first 11 chapters representing over 50% of the rest of the Bible. So there's 66 books in the Bible. 65 and a half, if you will, of those books don't quite equal the time that takes place in the first 11 chapters. That's why this is so important, because it sets the basis for everything that happens throughout the rest of Scripture. Genesis is the beginning. It is talking about the creation and how God has created the heavens and the earth. Let me go through this real quick. On the first day, he said, "Let there be light." You find that in 1:3. So if you read 1:3 through 5, God said, "Let there be light." From that day, he goes to the second day. There, he talks about the firmament, which is actually putting air, oxygen, if you will, into everything that around so that we can have something to breathe. On the third day, dry land appears, and dry land and plant life. On the fourth day, the sun, the moon, the stars. He now creates everything else that goes out there, the sun, the moons, and the stars. On the fifth day, he starts the move towards biology by creating animals. And then we have the sixth day. The sixth day is when God created man. The seventh day, which is often referred to as the Sabbath, then God rested. We then get into the issue of man here on earth. And in chapters 3 and 5, go through and tells us about two things. It tells us about how sin entered into man, and it also lets us know what's going to take to bring man back to the original state that God had created him. Now let's talk a little bit real quick about how sin entered into man.
Genesis 3:15. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed.
What happens is, of course, the serpent, a reptile, begins to talk to Adam. The question is, how can an animal, a reptile in this case, be able to talk to Adam? Well, keep in mind that Einstein used roughly 10 to 11% of his brain, depending on who you look at, and Adam was 10 times smarter than Einstein because he used 100% of his brain. Just as you and I can tell a dog to come to sit and communicate with a dog on the very low level of our ability to think and to move, Adam was so powerful in the use of 100% of his brain that communicating with animals would not have been any big deal. So now we have Adam sin, disobeying God, falling away, and turning from God. This brings us to the central theme, and that is this: do we trust God or do we trust ourselves? So what Adam did with Eve was to try to cover his sins himself, that is, trusting in himself. Then God spoke to him to say, more or less, you cannot cover yourself. I have to cover your sin. How did God choose to cover sin? As hard as this may sound, God chose to cover sin by blood. In other words, in order to cover sin, something has to die. Something has to die. We're going to find this out a little later as we study the Bible, but the death of something, the blood of something, is what was needed to cover sin to bring people back to God. Now, you may think to yourself that's kind of a hard way to go, but this is God's way. And that's why it's important to understand that faith is, again, trusting God, not trusting ourselves, not trying to figure it out, but just trusting God anyway. And so we move from the fall. We get to chapters 5 and through 9, and we get into the Great Flood. Just about every major religion in the world has a flood story. They all talk about the Great Flood. So we know for a fact that this is a factual historical thing. And Noah came through the flood. Now, Noah, when we get to about chapter 8, Noah then reestablishes civilization, if you will. And in that case, we now move to the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel we'll find in chapter 10 and 11. Right in there, God began to talk about the Tower of Babel. Something interesting about the Tower of Babel. Would you read that for me?
Genesis chapter 11, 4 through 7. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they began to do. Now nothing that they purpose to do will be withheld from them."
So what God did here in the tower, as we see that, once again, let us build a tower. Let us build something that is for ourselves. And God says, no, you can't do that for yourself. You must trust in me. So what he did was he then broke up that gang by confusing the languages and sending people off into different areas. Now again, keep in mind, chapters 1 through 11 is over 2,000 years in the making. What we find is that there are people who lived over 900 years. In one case, Methuselah. Methuselah, read that about Methuselah.
Okay, Methuselah. This is in Genesis, the 5th chapter, the 27th verse. So all the days of Methuselah was 969 years, and he died.
969 years was just Methuselah. Methuselah lived for 969 years. We find Jared in the Bible. Jared, if we are reading through chapters 5, he lived for 962 years. Who else do we got that lived a long time? Noah, of course. Noah was 950 years. So it's easy to see that when these people you kind of add up the line and add up the lineage, and people having children at 136 years old going out fathering kids and stuff like that, that it is not impossible for you to know for a fact that the book of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, covered a span of over 2,000 years. In that, we find again the very basis of everything that will come forward in the Bible. Again, what we find is the creation. What we find is sin. What we find is the way of redemption. And what we find is the line of the generations, the line that God had chosen by which to bring about deliverance from the sin that was committed. The sin of Adam. It had to be cleansed. And through the book of generations, what God did was show the line by which the Messiah would come. We have to understand the first 11 chapters if we're going to understand the rest of the book. I now challenge you to read chapters 1 through 11. You thought you knew a little bit about the Bible, and maybe you did. But now I hope you've learned a little bit more. We're going to come back next time with Abraham, chapter 12, for the next portion of this lesson. Thank you. See you next time.
Bye.